Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 804 for February 2nd, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
American whiskey has suffered a 29% drop in exports to the European Union since their tariffs came into effect. So the figures that we're seeing, I don't think are very far off what the ultimate impact might be. And, we said earlier this week that, we think we're looking at about £100 million in lost exports to the US over a year.
For more than 3 years now, we've been talking about the potential impact of Brexit on the whiskey industry. Now that Brexit is here as of this weekend, all anyone seems to be able to focus on is the impact of tariffs. That's where Scotch Whisky Association Chief Executive Karen Betts spent her time this week, joining her counterparts from the US and Europe to meet with European and UK leaders to try and get tariffs targeting whiskeys on both sides of the Atlantic removed. She cleared some time on her calendar this week to talk with us, too. We'll also talk with Speyside Distillers Managing Director Patricia Dillon, who is feeling the impact of the U.S. tariff on single malts from Scotland directly. There's a pallet load of Spey single malt worth $131,000 on the dock at her distillery that will not be heading to the U.S. anytime soon because of the tariffs. That's just ahead, along with the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and our latest Whiskey Club of the month. It's all just ahead on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. While we'll be talking more about the battle to get rid of whiskey tariffs later on, it is worth noting that leaders from the Distilled Spirits Council of the U.S., the Scotch Whisky Association, and Spirits Europe met with European Union leaders in Brussels, Paris, and other European capitals this past week. They also joined Scotch Whisky Association leaders to meet with UK officials in London and call for a return to tariff-free trade. American whiskey exports to Europe are down by 29% for the period from last January through November compared to the previous year, when the EU imposed its 25% tariff on American whiskeys to retaliate for the Trump administration's tariffs on steel and aluminum imported from Europe. There has been a similar impact on Scotch whisky exports to the U.S. in October and November, following the U.S. decision to impose a similar tariff on single malts imported from Scotland and Northern Ireland. Once again, whiskey is collateral damage, since the tariff was part of countermeasures imposed by the U.S. in the long-running dispute between the U.S. and Europe over aircraft subsidies for Airbus and Boeing. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had pledged in the run-up to the UK's recent parliamentary elections that he would drop the tariff on American whiskies as soon as Brexit became official. That happened this past Friday night, but the tariff will remain in place until at least the end of this year. Remember, while the UK has pulled out of the European Union, the next 11 months will be a transition period while Great Britain negotiates its future relationship with the EU. While it can start negotiating free trade agreements with other countries, it is still bound by EU policies during that transition, and that means the Prime Minister can't just drop the tariff on American whiskeys right away. Diageo announced its earnings for the first half of the fiscal year this week, and the world's largest spirits company reported a 4% increase in sales with a 0.5% rise in operating profits. Sales growth was strongest in North America and the Asia-Pacific region, but global sales of Johnny Walker fell by 4% over the previous year. CEO Ivan Menezes blamed that on strong sales last year of the Johnnie Walker Game of Thrones limited edition releases, and noted that the brand had double-digit sales hikes in India, China, and Africa. Menezes also said Diageo should be able to manage the impact of the U.S. tariffs because of its broad portfolio, but said the wider impact on the industry could cost thousands of jobs in Scotland and the U.S., and is, quoting now, very much hoping the governments on both sides of the Atlantic get to some sense on this. Let's move on, though. One big transaction on the financial side of the industry this week. Suntory Holdings has agreed to buy a 10% stake in Edrington for an undisclosed amount. Edrington declined to make executives available for interviews this week, saying that the deal will not have any impact on the company's day-to-day operations. The two companies have been closely aligned for more than 2 decades. While Edrington owns the Macallan, Suntory has owned a minority stake in the brand for many years, and Suntory Holdings also distributes Edrington's spirits portfolio in Japan, Canada, Germany, and other markets. In a statement, Edrington said the deal will provide funds to the Robertson Trust, which is the company's largest shareholder, and distributes much of its share of Edrington profits to charities throughout Scotland. There will also be additional funding for Edrington's employee ownership program as well. Meanwhile, British Columbia's Goodridge and Williams distillery made a splash debut in the Canadian whiskey market during the recent Canadian Whiskey Awards. Its Western Grains Canadian whiskey won a gold medal and was named the best whiskey value among domestic releases. Now, Labatt Breweries of Canada has acquired Goodridge and Williams for an undisclosed amount. Labatt is part of the AB InBev brewing conglomerate. Analysts say the deal was based more on the success of the Goodridge and Williams ready-to-drink canned cocktails. Founder Paul Meehan will continue to manage operations at the distillery, and all 15 employees will keep their jobs. If you've been following the progress of Ian MacLeod Distillers as it works to reopen the historic Rosebank Distillery in Scotland, we may see some news on that front this week. There's a new video on social media highlighting some of the legacy at Rosebank, and the distillery has been encouraging Rosebank lovers to sign up for its email newsletter with the hint that there'll be, quote, exciting news coming in the next week. While Rosebank spokesman declined to be more specific, we do know that Ian MacLeod has been working to bottle some of the existing Rosebank casks it acquired as part of its deal with Diageo back in 2017 for the rights to the Rosebank name. I don't have any inside information, but it wouldn't surprise me if that exciting news centered on the first release or two from those older casks. We'll have more details as they're available. Let's talk about new whiskeys that we do know about now. Angel's Envy is out with the second release in its Cellar Collection series. It's a bourbon finished in tawny port wine barrels from Portugal, and co-founder Wes Henderson says it's a follow-up to last year's release of Angel's Envy finished in Oloroso sherry casks.
It's a 10-year-old bourbon. It's our oldest bourbon we've ever released, and then finished for another 10 months in the tawny port barrel. And it's really hard to describe, Mark. It's got such depth and character, and the age of the bourbon really complements that tawny port very well. The dried fruits in the tawny, all those notes. It's 111 proof, which is it's a little bit higher. We wanted it that way to preserve the kind of the original integrity of the bourbon. But we're really happy with it. The initial folks that have tasted it seem to be very happy as well, and so I just love doing these special releases like this.
Only 5,400 bottles will be available at retailers in Kentucky, Tennessee, California, Florida, Illinois, and New York, along with the distillery's shop in Louisville. The price tag, around $250 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at WhiskyCast.com, and we'll hear more from Wes later on in our Behind the Label segment. Meanwhile, Craigellachie has also released its oldest bottling for sale. It's a 39-year-old single cask that's available exclusively at the World of Whiskies shops in London's Heathrow Airport. The whiskey comes from a single ex-bourbon hogshead cask that produced 138 bottles. Each one sells for 3,500 pounds, or about $4,600 each. And let's clarify that it's the oldest Craigellachie ever released for sale. The 51-year-old Craigellachie unveiled last year was never made available for sale, but was poured for free at a series of tastings in bars around the world. Continuing with the trend of oldest whiskeys from a distillery, Suntory will be holding a lottery in Japan for the right to buy one of the 100 bottles of its upcoming Yamazaki 55-year-old single malt. The winners will pay 3 million Japanese yen per bottle. That converts to around $27,600 each. The lottery starts this Wednesday, the 5th, and will run through the 14th on the Suntory website in Japan. We got some advance word of Highland Park's plans for 2020. While Valfather, the final release in the current Highland Park Viking Series trilogy, is on track to reach the U.S. this spring, plans are in the works to launch a new trilogy later this year that will also have a focus on the brand's Nordic heritage. There will also be a new permanent cask strength Highland Park release this summer and a new 50-year-old single malt at the end of the year in time for the holidays. We'll have more details as those releases are introduced. Jameson is releasing its cold brew coffee-infused Irish whiskey in the U.S. after a series of test releases in Ireland and Australia. It's technically a liqueur since it's bottled at 30% ABV, and it'll be available for a limited time with a recommended retail price of about $25 a bottle. Virginia's Catoctin Creek Distilling released 2 new whiskeys this weekend in a partnership with Beltway Brewing Company. Octo Malt, American malt whiskey, started out as Beltway's Octo IPA, while the Farmhouse Pale Malt is distilled from Beltway's Farmhouse Pale Ale. Both will be available at the distillery in Purcellville, Virginia. Catoctin Creek will also be releasing its latest batch of Rabble Rouser Bottled in Bond Rye Whiskey later this month on the 15th. And finally, by the time you're hearing this, we'll know the winner of Sunday night's Super Bowl matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the Kansas City Chiefs, and we'll know the winner of a bet between Sonoma County Distilling in Northern California and J. Rieger & Sons Distillery in Kansas City. Sonoma County Distilling's Adam Spiegel challenged his counterparts at Rieger's to a bet this weekend on Instagram before the game, and Rieger's immediately accepted the bet. The stakes: the loser has to send a case of whiskey to the winner and display the winning team's flag in their distillery for a month. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. Mr. Fitzgerald was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side. Today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the new limited edition release of Larceny Barrel Proof. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Whiskey Exchange is celebrating its return to the London Bridge neighborhood with a launch night tasting this Thursday night, February 6th. The Scotch Whisky Society's Australian chapter has a tasting that same night in Melbourne. The Houston Whiskey Social is on the 8th. Whiskey Spring is the 14th through the 16th in Schwetzingen, Germany. There's an Uncle Nearest Whiskey Dinner on the 18th with master blender Victoria Edie Butler at APL Restaurant in Hollywood, California. The Taipei Whiskey Club has a Kings Barnes and Weems Malts tasting on the 19th. Dr. Don Livermore teaches his Canadian Whiskey Blending 101 class on the 21st. at the J.P. Wiser's Experience at Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, Ontario. Don't forget to join us the weekend of March 7th and 8th for special coverage from Dramfest 2020 in Christchurch, New Zealand. Tickets are still available, and I'll have details next time around on a special tasting I'll be doing that week while I'm in Christchurch. Right now, we have 284 different events around the world on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just click on the search button to find out what's happening near you or wherever you'll be traveling this year.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. 2020 could be a critical year for the whiskey industry worldwide, and it could be the year the global boom in whiskey sales starts to falter. After more than 2 decades of tariff-free whiskey trading between the U.S., Europe, Canada, and other key trading partners helped raise global whiskey sales to an all-time high, the trade war that started in 2017 and hit the whiskey industry in 2018 threatens to derail that growth. It started when the Trump administration in the U.S. decided to impose punitive tariffs in 2018 on shipments of steel and aluminum from the European Union, Canada, China, and other countries. Administration officials cited the need to protect domestic steel producers, claiming that a reliance on imports of specialty metals for military and other uses threatened U.S. national security. That led to the EU, China, Canada, and other countries imposing a 25% retaliatory tariff on exports of American whiskey and other goods. They picked those goods because the U.S. is a net importer of steel and for the political impact in the U.S. When the World Trade Organization ruled in favor of the U.S. last autumn in a 15-year-long dispute with Europe over subsidies for Airbus and Boeing, that gave the Trump administration the green light to impose new tariffs on more than $7 billion worth of European exports. And the administration included single malt whiskies from Scotland and Northern Ireland on the tariff list. That's how we got to this point. This week, industry leaders continued their lobbying push on both sides of the Atlantic to persuade the politicians to back down, with the focus this week on Europe after a mission in Washington a couple of weeks ago. As I mentioned during the news, leaders of Spirits Europe, the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, and the Scotch Whisky Association presented a united front in Brussels, London, and Paris. Karen Betts is the CEO of the Scotch Whisky Association.
As the European Union and the United States government get into sort of renew their efforts on trade negotiations this year, and as the UK government and the US government does the same as the UK leaves the European Union, there are tariffs and the damage being caused by them are front and centre of those talks. We stress to everybody on each side of the Atlantic that our industry is united, and that the tariffs have to be dropped as quickly as possible because they are having a tangible impact on businesses.
Let's get into that impact because the SWA released this week sort of the first real analysis of the impact of those tariffs in the U.S.
So it's going to take a little time for the data to settle down, but we do have export figures for single malt Scotch whiskies to the United States for October and November last year now. And so the value of Scotch whisky exports to the United States dropped to 26% in October 2019 and then 33% in November 2019 on the same period in the year before. Now, it's hard for us, without looking at data over a period, really to understand what the trends will be. But when we talk to the American spirits industry, American whiskey has suffered a 29% drop in exports to the European Union since their tariffs came into effect. So the figures that we're seeing, I don't think are very far off what the ultimate impact might be. And, we said earlier this week that, we think we're looking at about £100 million in lost exports to the US over a year.
Since the U.S. is your largest export market by value, that is a significant impact.
It is a significant impact, and as we've discussed before, the impact falls disproportionately on smaller distillers. Our smaller distillers tend only to produce single malt, and all of them will be producing brands that they are selling into the US, and niche, interesting brands that you will see in many of your whiskey and your specialist whiskey stores. And so it's really impactful for those companies. When we were in London earlier this week talking to ministers in the UK government, we had a couple of our member companies with us, and one of them was saying that their importers are unwilling to take any more single malt at the moment until they know that they can sell the stocks that they have.
That member was Patricia Dillon, the managing director of Speyside Distillers, which owns the Speyside Distillery and its Spey single malt.
Since the tariffs hit us, we have not exported anything over to the US because the importer that we work with, who we've worked with now for 3 years, there has been a downturn in demand for single malt whiskey because of the tariffs. So we haven't shipped anything into the US, and we had produced product, our single malt, award-winning single malt Spey whiskey, and that was already ready on the floor to go to the US. But unfortunately, we have a stockpile now of case goods lying in our warehouse that we cannot ship to the US.
Has your importer said they'd be willing to work with you once the tariffs are removed?
Well, the distributors that our importer is working with have showed grave concern to our importers and seem to be turning away from single malt and focusing on blended or rum or other spirits for the fear of single malt. So they don't particularly want to bring it in. We haven't even had the opportunity to work on, how we would absorb it, whether we would absorb Sun or an importer. We haven't had that opportunity because they're already turning away from the single malt as a category in the US because of the tariffs. So the actual orders that we've got on the floor, they're not cancelled, they're ready, they're on the floor, they have labels with the importer's name on it, and they're 75 CL, so it's not as if you can just ship them to another country in Europe, for example.
Ed Cole owns Keeper's Quest Imports and is Spey's U.S. importer. He's caught in the middle between the distillery and his customers, the regional distributors and their retail clients.
Everybody is backing off on inventory. They're not willing to bring new inventories in until they deplete what they have because they really don't know what's going to happen. They're asking me, are you going to raise your prices? And I said, well, in most cases, yes, I have to. I've got to maintain margin in order to keep my business open. And the result of that is they're saying, well, okay, then I don't really need to pick anything up yet. We'll get back to you when we need another order, and maybe you'll have more information. And I think that's happening right down the line. I mean, they're getting backed up from their retailers. The retailers are backing up, and so are the restaurateurs. Everybody's backing up on this stuff because they don't know what's going on. They don't know how long this is going to last.
Speyside Distillers is not the only Scotch whisky producer being hurt by the single malt tariff, though. We know that Kilchoman and its U.S. importer Impacts have agreed to split the cost of the tariff on their shipments to try and keep their retail prices consistent. But that's not an option for Dillon and many of her colleagues. She sits on the Scotch Whisky Association's board and has heard what many of her colleagues are going through.
Some of them have been hit very badly. One company had their order halved in two, so there was an order placed, and because of the tariffs, their importer only took half of the order, so they have been left with half an order on the floor to the value of around 70k. Another company have had to absorb with their importer, half each. They've shared, the tax. So yeah, a lot of people are being hit in very different ways, but the smaller producers are finding it very hard. The larger producers, the bigger companies like Diageo and Chivas, they are campaigning and working very strongly and very hard also with Scotch Whisky Association to have the tariff lift. Although it's not hit blended whisky, it may and it could hit blended whisky, but Chivas, Diageo, etc., Pernod Ricard, Grants, they're all working very closely with SWA and smaller members on the effort to try and get this lifted, especially to help the smaller members, the smaller companies that are getting hit the worst at the moment.
As a reminder, this whole dispute started over steel and aluminum exports and spread through a dispute over aircraft subsidies. Nowhere was whiskey ever the actual issue, making it collateral damage in the larger trade conflict. And Karen Betts, a former British ambassador, fully realizes that.
The European Commission understands how serious this is for our industry. I suspect they understood that when they imposed the tariff on bourbon 18 months ago. And, I think they do want to work with the industry to get the tariffs removed, but obviously in order to do that, they need to see some other things shift that they are interested in EU-US trade. And that was broadly the message that we had back from the US administration as well. They're not unsympathetic to our plight, but the tariffs were put on products in our industry to help focus government minds on either side of the Atlantic on some of the other somewhat intractable issues in trade relations that we've seen recently. Of course, it's a bit awkward for the UK within Europe now. The United Kingdom leaves the European Union today, and so the European Commission will no longer be representing our industry, the Scotch whisky industry, or our concerns to the US. So we need to rely on the UK government to do that now.
After the meetings recently in Washington, Distilled Spirits Council CEO Chris Swanger told us about their meeting with senior Trump administration officials.
They're playing long, and they believe for national security purposes and a whole variety of purposes that they have to take an aggressive approach and an aggressive posture. And one of the tools that they have in their tool belt is tariffs. And obviously that has created a lot of pain and consternation by our industry.
Not only does it appear that the U.S. won't be removing the single malt whiskey tariff anytime soon, the Trump administration is considering an increase from 25% to as high as 100%, and perhaps even expanding it to more whiskeys imported from the UK and Europe. SPA's Patricia Dillon believes that could hurt the whiskey industry worldwide for years to come.
If it is raised, then that's pretty catastrophic for the US market for us. And I think in general it's catastrophic because when you have spent 3 years building a brand and you are a small brand, when you've built all of that time, it takes a lot because you're not a recognised brand like Macallan or Glenfiddich or Glenmorangie or Glenlivet, especially Macallan in the US. You have this consumer following and you're building a single malt. Once that damage is already done, like now, it's hard to retrieve that back. So we already have that challenge. If we go to 100%, we have no chance at all. The US is an absolute key market for Scotch as a brand and Scotch whisky. The rest of the world look towards the UK and the US quite regularly for what consumers are buying. Asia is a very good market for Scotch whisky also. They look over to the US and to the UK to see what the consumers are buying. If we strategically don't have a presence in the US, that affects our volume in other markets because they're not looking towards the position we have in the US with our single malt whiskey.
Is it the kind of thing where we could see some smaller distillers go out of business over this?
Well, Mark, our business, of course, if there's 100% tariff or there's the 25 and we can't absorb it, and we've not made our decision yet. The US is a very important market for us. The US is a very sophisticated, very mature intelligent consumer market on Scotch. They've been drinking Scotch for a long time, and it's a key market for us. We want to be present. We know that we only produce so much Scotch that we allocate to the US. We know we could take that back and look at the efforts of selling into other markets, but not just because we want a presence in the US. We want the consumers in the US to have our whiskey. So many smaller distillers like us will have to reconsider whether their whiskey will be in the US or whether they have to take it and strategically position it in another market so that it won't affect their business and that not to let themselves go out of business. So they will have preventative methods in place to go to other parts of the world. So they'll have preventative and they'll be reconsidering their position. But Mark, I don't think I can see them getting out of business.
And on this side of the Atlantic, importer Ed Cole says a 100% tariff could decimate the U.S. whiskey industry.
The 25% will suffer through it. But if they ever threw that 100% on there, forget it. Lights out. That's it. It's over. No way we'd be able to survive anything like that. Eventually, even the big boys at that point will have to raise prices. And you have the potential of, let's go back in history. So what happened after Prohibition? 1933, Prohibition was repealed. What happened? There was a guy by the name of Joseph Seagrams up in Canada who was amassing huge quantities of Canadian whiskey, and he flooded the U.S. market with it the minute it became legal because bourbon and rye was gone. Well, all of a sudden, guess what? Now everybody's drinking Canadian whiskey. They're going to do the same thing. I mean, this is dangerous. This is very, very, very dangerous because you're talking about changing consumer trends. Wow.
In fact, he saw evidence of that this weekend.
I see consumers moving over into other products. In fact, I heard it this past weekend when they did this tasting up in Omaha, Nebraska. Consumers were coming in saying, it's getting kind of expensive. We're looking at tasting some other stuff, and rum seems to be a new category that everybody seems to be heading towards. That's interesting.
Could the Scotch whisky tariff be removed in the upcoming trade talks between Great Britain and the U.S.? Yes, in theory, but keep in mind that the Trump administration is focused heavily on getting other U.S. agricultural products into the U.K. as part of that deal, following years of opposition from the European Union. And the U.S. is likely to demand other concessions from the British government as well. That makes it even less likely that things will change anytime soon. We'll keep tracking the developments on this story as they happen. And that's WhiskyCast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I've been fighting a cold this week, but that gives us a chance to catch up on some of the whiskeys I've tasted over the last month or so. Let's start with one of the Spey single malts from Speyside Distillery, the port cask finished Spey Byron's Choice. It was released in 2015 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Lord Byron's wedding and was bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is honey sweet with dried flowers, hints of oak and spice, red grapes, and toffee. The taste has a good balance of honey, tree fruits, and baking spices with just a hint of toffee, and the finish is long and fruity with hints of spice in the background. It's excellent. I'm giving the Spey Byron's Choice a 93. Islay barrels wind up in some of the most unusual places, like Canada's Vancouver Island, where Shelter Point Distillery used some peat-infused barrels from a certain Islay distillery that rhymes with Mabroig to finish its Smoke Point Canadian whiskey. This one's unusual for Shelter Point in that Well, one, it's the first time they've done anything with peat, and second, it's actually a single grain whiskey, since they used both malted and unmalted barley to make it. Smoke Point is bottled at 55% ABV, and the nose has notes of smoked maple, bacon, dark honey, muted spices, and a soft oakiness. The taste is thick and malty at first, followed by a spicy burst of chili powder and cinnamon. The spices fade slowly to reveal sweeter notes of maple, brown sugar, and honey. The finish is long with slowly fading spices, balanced by a subtle sweetness. It's one of Shelter Point's best whiskeys yet. In fact, I brought home a bottle, and I'm scoring Smoke Point a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey. It celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Had the chance to taste a couple of different Wolfburn single malts while I was in Victoria recently. Number 375 is from the distillery's Small Batch series. It's matured in half-size first fill ex-bourbon barrels and bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is crisp and light with hints of dried fruits, honey, caramel, and a bit of toffee. The taste is warm and peppery with sweet notes of honey and tree fruits that come out as the spices begin to fade. They fade slowly through the finish with a nice balance of dried fruits, honey, and caramel. I'm scoring Wolfburn's number 375 an 89. And Langskip is the oldest Wolfburn release yet, with whiskeys matured for between 5 and 7 years in ex-bourbon barrels. It's bottled at 58% ABV. The nose is malty with notes of dried flowers, honey, tree fruits, vanilla, and caramel candy. The taste is spicy and complex with white pepper, clove, and a hint of cinnamon, complemented by barley sugar, honey, and a hint of citrus. They lead to a long and well-balanced finish. And I'm scoring the Wolfburn Langskip single malt a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out today at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Time to announce our latest Whiskey Club of the Month. Congratulations to the Morgantown Whiskey Club in Morgantown, West Virginia. Co-founder Carl Schmidt sent us an email recently to nominate his club, which is still fairly new, but growing quickly with monthly events. We've added a link to the club's website on our Whiskey Clubs page at whiskycast.com, and, more importantly, we'll be sending them 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at their club tastings. If you're in a whiskey club and want to nominate your club for our Whiskey Club of the Month, all you have to do is use the contact form at the WhiskyCast website and tell us a bit about your club. It might just help your club win a set of WhiskyCast Glencairns to use at your club meetings. And thanks to Glencairn Crystal for helping us support whiskey clubs around the world. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. I don't always get a lot of comments on my tasting notes, but Anna in Seattle at Will Run for Whiskey had this comment on Instagram following last week's episode with my tasting notes for Westland's 2020 Peat Week single malt. She wrote, Westland's Peat Week from this year was so interesting. An earthy, unique flavor that's uncommon. I also had my tasting notes last week for the Tobermory 12-year-old. Tim Mushaw in Maryland asked this on our Facebook page. Has anyone heard when Tobermory will be available in the States again? Well, I checked in with Derek Scott, who oversees single malts for Distell in Scotland. He's hoping to have Tobermory back into the U.S. market during the first half of this year. We shared that with Tim on Facebook. Here's his response. Thanks. That's awesome. I visited Mull a couple of years ago. I'm out of Tobermory and down to less than half a bottle of Lechig. Well, that's a crisis in itself. And thanks to Ranger Rick on Twitter for sharing some photos with us of the long-abandoned Overholt Whiskey Distillery near Pittsburgh. The photos were the work of Scott Benson, and you can find them on his Twitter feed at Bombs Fall. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at WhiskyCast. Or you can just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and the other things that all combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And this time around, we're going to raise a stink, literally. You may have noticed a whiff of sulfur in your whiskeys from time to time, but where does it come from? Well, small traces of sulfur can be created as one of the byproducts in the fermentation process. Yeast cells consume the sugars in a mash and turn them into alcohol, but they also produce carbon dioxide. And let's just be honest about it. Carbon dioxide is gas, and the sulfur is what makes the gas stink just a bit. This will not be the only fart reference during this segment, though. Fortunately, most of the sulfur does not make it through distillation. The most common source of sulfur in whiskey is casks that have been treated with sulfur to sterilize them. Sulfur dioxide gas is commonly used by winemakers to sterilize casks, and back in the day, it was common to stick a burning sulfur candle inside a freshly emptied barrel and let the smoke from the candle fill the barrel to kill any bacteria before it was reused for wine. Given the number of wine cask finishes we're seeing, it is surprising that we don't see more whiskeys showing traces of sulfur or other problems that can be caused when wine casks are shipped to distilleries to be used for whiskey. Any wine left in those casks can spoil during shipping in warm weather and create a sulfur compound. And since wine's fermentation process continues in the barrel, there's also the potential for yeast contamination and what's called secondary fermentation. During the news earlier, we heard from Wes Henderson about the new Angel's Envy finished in tawny port barrels. Those barrels went by container ship and truck from Portugal to Louisville. So I asked Wes how they avoided any problems.
A lot of times we'll have them shipped with a couple liters of wine to keep the staves moist, and I think that's helpful. And, there's always going to be a barrel here or there that you have to discard, but really the first thing you do when these things come in, we just stick our nose down in there, and we're going to know right away. We'll do some analytics, too, to see whether or not those sulfur clip. My nose is I'm like a truffle hunting pig as far as sulfur goes. My nose is so sensitive to sulfur, even very small amounts that, I can probably detect it, quicker than anybody else. So you have to watch out for that. I don't think we've ever had, I think our cask strength from 2014 that's the one that finished in the port barrel for almost 3 years. I think that had some sulfur notes in it, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think with wines, that's to be expected. But because I'm so sensitive to it, I'm not a big fan of sulfur. But that's just an example of something sitting in a port wine barrel for a long, long time, or like you just said, sitting on a ship in a container ship coming across the Atlantic Ocean. Long story short, you stick your nose in there. It's not very scientific.
Did you always have that ability to pick out sulfur, or was this part of your history as a firefighter?
Oh, that's a really good question. No, it's just always been that way. I don't know why my nose is so sensitive to those compounds, but, in this case, it serves as well. Of course we do in the fire service, certainly, with gas leaks and stuff like that. And that's probably good for me too, because I a lot of times smell that before anybody else smells it. And, the last thing you want to be doing is be standing in a closed space with a bunch of natural gas in the air.
Was your father sensitive to sulfur?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, Dad's had such a highly evolved, sensory, portfolio, let's call it that, in his head and in his mouth and his nose. And I think that, like anybody else, that evolves over time. And I'm always trying to sharpen those things by doing, sensory exercises and, comparisons of reference aromas and reference flavors. And I firmly believe you can teach somebody how to taste. Some people are better equipped on an olfactory basis to receive that instruction. But, we have a sensory group here that we've trained by and large, and they're great at what they do. So I don't know. I wish I could say I had this like magic gift and, but I don't really know. Maybe it's a fluke.
I was wondering if it might be genetic. If your dad was sensitive to it, maybe that's why you're sensitive to it.
Well, and that's another really good point. You probably tell you something you probably know, but a lot of listeners may not know. With asparagus, people talk about when you eat asparagus, your urine smells funny, and some people can smell it, some people can't. Well, everybody's urine gets that aroma after you eat asparagus. Just some people genetically cannot smell it. So that's a really good example of somebody that has a predisposition for a certain aroma. And that's a really good thought.
Do you know if your sons are sensitive? Have you checked them out on it?
No, they're very sensitive. They cry if I look at them the wrong way. As far as that's definitely not an issue with them. Let me tell you, they're definitely not sensitive like that. I think that everybody has their own thing. I've never really discussed it with them, but they've learned so much on a sensory basis. And, I pushed them in this thing from day one, the ones that were old enough. Actually, only Kyle was the only one that was old enough to be anywhere near it when we started it. But, as soon as they were able, I had them doing sensory. So, they've learned. And most importantly, they know on a sensory basis what our product is supposed to be. And, we can expand that into other things. And they're learning how to put stuff together. And, I'm pretty proud of how they're doing.
And before that, it was just exercises with fart smells and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the normal boy things in a house with 6 boys, sweaty socks, funky shoes, no shower for 3 days, the usual boy thing. And you have to remind them to take a shower. I think I'm past that now. My youngest is 16. And every once in a while, it'll be like over a weekend. It's like, Ian, it's been a couple of days. You might want to consider, bathing or whatever. I think we're glad we're past that. I know my wife is definitely glad we're past that because she was never a fan of boy smells. So it's good, but she still got me, and I'm the biggest kid. I'm the biggest child she has. So, she still has to deal with me.
They're going to love it when they hear this on the show,
Oh, that's fine. That's great. I love it. They listen. They love your show. So look, I mean, anybody that knows us and has been around us and, we'll talk about anything. We don't really, we're about as open and as frank sometimes to the point of, our marketing people cringe sometimes when I talk because I just say whatever's on my mind. And, but that's a relationship we have with the fans of Angels Envy. We've got an honest relationship. We've got a real relationship. And that's one of the other things that makes it very special.
And thanks to Wes Henderson for sharing, perhaps too much sharing, with us on Behind the Label. If you have something you'd like us to look at on a future episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com, along with links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. And the email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.